Nobody warned her about the owl. That was the thing Alara Voss would think about later. Much later. When everything had already changed, and the world she thought she understood had rearranged itself around her, like a puzzle that had always had a different solution. Nobody warned her. Not the senior archivists who had worked beneath Ethan's tower for decades. Not the palace guards who stamped their boots against the frozen flagstones every morning. Not even Maris, who was 3 years her senior. In the archives, and made it her personal mission to ensure Alara understood every unwritten rule of surviving inside the palace of Velthorn. Nobody said, "Watch yourself, girl, because the great snow owl has been still for 11 years, and something in you is going to wake it up." So Alara was entirely unprepared for the morning she stepped into the north courtyard with a stack of manuscripts pressing cold leather against her forearms, looked up out of habit, because the winter sky above Velthorn was the only beautiful thing she allowed herself to enjoy freely, and found 2 amber eyes the size of her fists staring directly back at her from the parapet 40 feet above. She stopped walking. The manuscripts nearly slid from her grip. The owl was not merely large in the way that impressive birds were large, but vast in a way that made her brain struggle to process it. Sitting with its white wings folded against its body like a carved thing, like something placed there deliberately by a sculptor who understood that certain shapes existed to make smaller creatures feel the precise nature of their smallness. Its feathers were the white of old snow, layered and dense with the memory of every winter it had absorbed. And it was watching her. Not the courtyard, not the sky, not the other 2 servants who crossed the far end of the yard without looking up. It was watching her specifically, with the focused, total attention of a creature that did not possess the capacity for casual glances. Alara stood there for 11 seconds. She counted, because counting was what she did when her body forgot how to move. Then she looked down at the manuscripts in her arms, looked back up, and the owl was still there, still watching. Its enormous head tilted at an angle that suggested curiosity of the most profound and patient variety. She made herself walk. She crossed the remaining distance of the courtyard at a pace that was almost normal, pushed through the archive door, and did not mention it to Maris, who was already complaining about the inventory of the Eastern Treaty records and did not need another reason to think Alara was unusual. She did not think about it for the rest of the day. She was very good at not thinking about things. The second morning, it was on a lower parapet. Closer. The third morning, it was on the roof of the colonnade that ran along the north courtyard's eastern wall, and she could hear the soft sound of its breathing, a slow, enormous rhythm like wind moving through a hollow space. She could see the individual feathers along its chest ruffling slightly in the cold air. It watched her cross the entire length of the colonnade. When she reached the far end and turned, which she should not have done, and yet could not stop herself from doing, it was still watching, with the expression, if an owl could be said to have an expression, of a creature that had been waiting for something for a very long time and had recently received information that the waiting was nearly over. By the 4th morning, people were noticing. "Ethan has not come down from the high towers in 11 years, Maris said, appearing beside Alara in the courtyard with the energy of someone who had spent the night accumulating information. Not since the old king died. Everyone says it withdrew when King Aldrich passed. The court scholars call it grief, but the older servants say the owl does not grieve. It waits. It waits for something to be worth watching." Again, she paused. "And now it is watching you. It is watching the courtyard," Alara said. "I happened to be in the courtyard. It followed you to the southern stacks yesterday," Maris said. "Aldrich saw it on the window ledge outside the arched window while you were cataloging inside. It has never gone to the southern stacks. In 40 years of recorded palace history, Ethan has never left the north wing." Another pause. "Alara, I need to finish the Caldenmore Treaty records," Alara said. And she walked away before Maris could say whatever she was clearly building toward, because Alara had learned long ago that things said out loud had a tendency to become real, and she was not ready for whatever this was to become real yet. If you are enjoying this story, do not forget to leave a like and subscribe to the channel for more emotional stories like this one. She had been at Valethorn for 4 years. She had arrived at 19, with letters of recommendation that described her as meticulous, perceptive, and possessed of an unusually comprehensive memory for text. The palace archivist, a narrow man named Dorveth, who smelled of old paper and spent most of his time pretending his current staff did not exist, had taken one look at her letters and one look at her. A thin girl in a traveling cloak with mud on her boots and no family name worth speaking, and assigned her to the lowest tier of cataloging work. Nobody wanted the pre-war correspondence from border regions written in dialects so obscure that half the archive staff could not read without assistance. Ilara could read it without assistance. She could read 6 regional dialects and 4 dead court languages, because when you grew up in a household that had books but very little else, you read what was available and you read it thoroughly. Dorveth never promoted her because Dorveth did not notice her, which meant that 4 years later she was still cataloging obscure correspondence and still occupying the smallest desk in the coldest corner of the archive. She did not have friends at court. She did not have enemies either, which she had always considered the more important achievement. She was invisible in the way that useful, quiet, unremarkable people were invisible, which was to say completely and comfortably, and with no indication that it might ever change. On the days when the work was finished, she sat in the north courtyard and looked at the sky, because the sky above Valethorn was extraordinary. A wide, pale expanse that turned colors in the winter she had never seen anywhere else. Lavender and amber, and a deep, bruised blue that appeared in the last minutes before full dark and made her chest ache in a way she had no proper word for. The owl had been watching her look at the sky. She understood that now, on the 4th morning. It had been watching from its high tower, watching her be the one person in the courtyard who consistently tilted her face toward the sky instead of keeping it pointed at the ground, and it had decided, at some point, that this was interesting enough to come closer to examine. That was all. That was surely all it was. She told herself this with the confidence of someone who had learned to believe the most reasonable explanation for things, and she was already very tired. The king noticed on the 5th day. She did not know this at the time. She learned it later, from the man himself, in a voice that carried no room for doubt. But on the 5th morning, while Ilara stood in the north courtyard, with a cup of something hot that passed for tea in the servants' kitchen, watching Ethan descend from the colonnade roof to a window ledge on the 1st floor of the north wing, at essentially the same level as her own face, King Cailan of Valethorn was standing at his study window on the 2nd floor of the east wing, 40 feet away and 1 floor up, watching both of them. She knew only the owl, which was so close now that she could see the faint pattern of gray in its white feathers, like shadows preserved in snow, and the amber of its eyes, which were layered, ringed, with shades of gold and copper and a deep brown at the pupil that seemed to contain more depth than eyes of that color had any right to contain. She stood and looked at it, and it looked at her, and the morning was very quiet around them both. Then one of the senior palace attendants, a woman named Orsten, who wore the gray sash of the king's household staff, appeared at the courtyard entrance. "Ilara Voss, you are to present yourself to the records office of the East Wing. There is a request for archival assistance with the ancient boundary texts." Orsten looked past her, briefly, at the window ledge where Ethan sat. Something moved in her expression that was gone before Ilara could identify it. "Immediately, please." The records office of the East Wing was a long room with high ceilings smelling of beeswax and old ink, and when Ilara entered she found it occupied by Lord Advisor Penthen, 2 clerks sorting through large flat documents on the central table, and a woman seated near the window she did not recognize. The woman was very still, very composed, wearing a deep green riding coat over a dress of pale gold that was expensive in a way that made expenses in every other context seem like a different concept entirely. She had dark hair, arranged with precision, and a face that had been assembled with a clear directive to produce something that would hold attention in any room it entered. She was holding a cup of tea and looking out the window, and did not look at Alara when Alara entered, which meant she was either uninterested or very practiced at seeming uninterested, and Alara's years of observing court behavior suggested the latter. "We need assistance with the Valethorn Boundary Codex," Penthen said. "The pre-consolidation land grants in the Northern Territories. The language is archaic. The documents were old, genuinely old, written on vellum in the Northern ecclesiastical hand, which had not been in common use for 200 years. Alara could read it. She began to read it. And then the woman by the window spoke, without turning her head. "You are the one the owl has been following." Alara looked up. The woman was now looking at her directly, with the particular quality of attention she had learned to recognize as evaluation. She was beautiful in the way that some weapons were beautiful, elegantly designed for a specific purpose and excellently suited to it. "I am Lady Seraphine Aldecourt. I have been at Valethorn for 2 weeks, negotiating with the King's Council, and in those 2 weeks I have asked a great many questions about that owl. It has not moved from the high towers since King Aldrich's death, until 5 days ago." A pause. "Until you." "I am certain it is coincidence," Alara said. "I am certain it is not," Seraphine said pleasantly, and returned her gaze to the window. Alara worked on the Boundary Codex for 3 hours. She translated the archaic Northern hand into clear court language, annotated the land grant terminology, and identified 3 provisions the clerks had been misreading due to a shift in the meaning of a specific legal term between eras. Penthen was satisfied. The clerks were relieved. Seraphine left before Alara finished, without saying goodbye, which was the kind of exit that managed to be notable precisely because of how little effort it made to be notable. Walking back to the archive that afternoon, Alara passed through the north courtyard and looked up automatically. The window ledge was empty. She told herself the absence was a relief and almost believed it. Ethan found her in the southern stacks at dusk. She heard it before she saw it. That slow, enormous breathing at the high arched window. And she turned and it was there, filling the window frame, its wings folded, its amber eyes catching the last of the winter light so that they glowed like lanterns in a face made of snow. She set down the correspondence she was holding and looked at it for a long moment. "I do not know what you want," she said, which was not the kind of thing she said out loud to anyone, let alone to an owl. "I do not know why you keep following me. I am nobody. I catalog old letters for a living. There is nothing about me that should be interesting to you." The owl tilted its head. Then it turned its head toward the door, and Alara turned too, and nobody was there. When she looked back, the window was empty. She stood for a moment in the silence of the stacks, and breathed, and told herself that she was a practical person, and practical people did not feel bereft, because an owl had left. She was not entirely successful. That night in the servants' hall, the conversation was about the alliance negotiations. The servants had opinions, as they always did, and the consensus was that the king would agree to the match with Lady Seraphine by the end of the month. The Aldecourt lands controlled 3 northern passes. The Valethorn treasury had been under pressure since the border disputes 3 years ago. Seraphine was, by any observable metric, an ideal match. Well-born, politically competent, attractive, and interested in power in the organized structural way that made her useful rather than merely ambitious. "He does not want to," said a young footman, with the certainty of someone who had recently been adjacent to evidence. "I have seen how he looks at her during the council meetings. He is polite. He is not warm." Alara ate her soup and did not comment, and went to bed and slept badly and dreamed of amber light. She met the king on the 7th day. This was not by design, or rather, not by her design. She had spent the 6th day working in the archive, and the 6th evening rereading her translation of the Boundary Codex, because something in it had continued to sit at an angle in her mind. Some provision about the ancient recognition. Rights of the Northern Territories that did not fit neatly into the legal framework she understood. By mid-morning she had identified what was bothering her. The pre-consolidation land grants contained a clause, buried in the ecclesiastical language the clerks had consistently misread as referring to livestock passage rights, that actually specified something entirely different. It specified the rights of the sacred creatures of the Northern Territories, specifically the ancient compact between the ruling house of Vailthorn and Ethan, described in the Codex not as a bird that belonged to the palace but as a sovereign entity in its own right, one whose recognition of a mate, bond within the ruling house constituted, under the old law, a formal legal event with specific consequences. Elara read this 4 times. Then she sat very still for a moment. Then she read it again. She was working through the implications when the archive door opened and Lord Advisor Penthen entered, and behind Penthen, moving with the particular quality of stillness that powerful men carried in their bodies the way ordinary people carried tension, was King Cailan of Vailthorn. Elara stood up. Everyone in the archive stood up. This was protocol. She had seen the king from a distance before, at the winter solstice gathering, at the formal court processions. She had seen him the way you saw mountains, as a fact of the landscape, not particularly relevant to the specific business of your daily life. She had not expected to see him in the archive. She had not expected him to look at her. He was taller than she had registered from the gallery, broader across the shoulders than formal portraits suggested, and he was formidable in the way that had nothing to do with formal authority and everything to do with the quality of his attention, which was, she realized in the first few seconds of being in the same room with him, total. He looked at things the way the owl looked at things. Not casually. Not as a sweep of assessment. He looked at things as if he intended to understand them, and his gaze, which had moved across the archive and landed on her with the matter-of-fact directness of someone arriving somewhere they had already decided to go, stayed. "You are the archivist who translated the Boundary Codex," he said. "Yes, Your Majesty," Elara said, and her voice was steady, which she counted as a significant personal achievement. "Penthen tells me you identified an error in the existing." Translation. 3 errors. "A shift in usage," she said. "The ecclesiastical Northern Hand has several terms that underwent meaning changes between the pre-consolidation era and the current period. The existing translation reflected the current meaning, rather than the original intent." What was the original intent of the passage regarding the Northern Territories? He was walking toward her as he spoke, and he stopped at a distance that was correct for a conversation between a king and a servant, and was also somehow not quite comfortable, as if the usual social geometry did not entirely apply to him. "The passage regarding land grants, or the passage regarding the Sacred Creature Compact?" she asked. Something shifted in his expression. It was subtle. She almost missed it. "There is a passage regarding the Sacred Creature Compact," he said. "Yes, Your Majesty." A silence. Behind him, Penthen made a small, uncomfortable sound. "Show me," the king said. She showed him. She spread the codex on the reading table and pointed to the passage and translated it aloud, the ecclesiastical hand flowing into plain speech under her voice, while Cailan stood beside her and read over her shoulder, close enough that she was aware of the warmth of him in the cold archive air, close enough that she could smell the faint cedar and wood smoke that clung to his coat. And she kept her voice even, and her attention on the text. When she finished, he was quiet for a long moment. "The Sacred Creature Compact," he said. "Under the old law, Ethan's recognition of a mate bond constitutes a formal legal event. According to the pre-consolidation codex, yes," she said. "The compact states that if Ethan were to recognize and pursue a specific individual, that individual is to be considered under the protection of the ruling house, regardless of their station, pending formal examination of their lineage." "Pending formal examination," he said. "Yes, Your Majesty." He looked at her then. Not at the codex, but at her. And she made herself hold the look because looking away would have felt like conceding something she was not sure she wanted to concede. His eyes were a dark gray, almost the color of the winter sky above the courtyard in the hour before dawn, and they held the same quality of depth she had noticed in the owl's amber ones, the sense of something that had seen a great deal and arrived at conclusions it did not offer casually. You knew what you were finding, he said. When you were translating it, you knew what it referred to. I understood the text, she said carefully, and you brought it to Penthen anyway. It would have been inaccurate to omit it, she said. He looked at her for a moment longer. Then, to her complete and total surprise, one corner of his mouth moved in something that was not quite a smile, but was in the neighborhood of one, the expression of a man who finds something genuinely unexpected, in a moment he had not expected to be genuinely surprised by anything. It was gone quickly. What is your name? He asked. Ilara Voss, Your Majesty. How long have you been at Valethorn? 4 years. He looked at her for another moment. I want a full translation of the Sacred Creature Compact sections, he said. All of them, not only the land grant provisions. Voss will handle it. He looked at her again, briefly. You will be given access to the restricted archive. Orsden will arrange it. And then he left, and Penthen hurried after him, and Ilara stood in the archive in the wake of his departure, and breathed and tried to identify what exactly had just changed, because something had, she was certain of it, with the same certainty she used to catalog the exact shade of meaning in old ecclesiastical texts. She was still standing there when the wing of something large brushed the window above her desk, and she looked up to find Ethan on the ledge, filling the frame, watching her with amber eyes that contained, she thought, in the particular manner of the completely fanciful thought she did not usually permit herself, the unmistakable quality of satisfaction. What do you think will happen next? Leave your predictions in the comments below. The restricted archive was in the lower north wing, 3 flights below the main archive, in a room cold in the specific way of underground spaces that had not been regularly heated. What she found there rearranged the structure of what she thought she knew about the history of Valethorn. The Sacred Creature Compact was not, as she had assumed from the Land Grant Codex, a brief provision in a larger legal document. It was its own corpus, a series of texts spanning 400 years, beginning with the first documented account of Ethan's presence in the territory and continuing through the establishment of the palace, the line of kings, and the recurring specific pattern of events described in the oldest text simply as the recognition. The owl did not belong to the ruling house. Ethan predated the ruling house. The first king of Valethorn had understood, with the pragmatism of a man who dealt in the currency of real power, that the ancient creature's presence was itself a form of authority that exceeded anything he could construct with stone or law. The compact had been an agreement between equals, and its terms were specific. Ethan would remain in the territory and offer its recognition to those of the old bloodlines when they appeared, and the ruling house would honor that recognition as law. The old bloodlines. She found the first reference to them in the second document, a text 300 years old that described the pre-consolidation families of the Northern Territories, with the specific reverence of someone who understood these families to be something categorically different from ordinary noble lineages. They were the descendants of the original human inhabitants of the territory, the people who had lived in the northern reaches. Before the pack system, before the Alpha hierarchy, before the formal structures of the lycanthrope kingdom had imposed themselves on the land. They had been the first wolf-touched, the first to be marked by the ancient magic of the territory, and they carried in their blood a heritage so old that most of them did not know it was there. Centuries of integration and displacement had diluted the external signs until they were essentially undetectable by conventional means. But Ethan could detect them. This was, according to the text, precisely what Ethan was for. Ilara sat in the cold underground room and read this 4 times. Then she sat very still. Then she thought about where she had been born. A village called Voss in the far northern reaches, a settlement of perhaps 40 families, who scratched a living from the cold ground and had no particular history worth speaking of, except that they had been there, always, as far back as anyone could remember. She thought about her grandmother, who had eyes the color of new ice, and hands that never felt cold, and who used to sit outside in the depths of winter and look at the sky, the same way Ilara looked at the sky, with that particular ache, as if the sky contained something she was always almost able to reach. She thought about the way she had always been able to read the old scripts without formal training. The way the ecclesiastical northern hand had looked familiar to her the first time she encountered it. Not like something foreign she was learning, but like something she was remembering. She thought about the owl. She went to find the palace herbalist, a woman named Kyla, who worked in a room off the west garden, and had the direct, undecorated interest of someone who did not have time for social navigation. "You are Ara's granddaughter," she said, before Alara had finished explaining why she was there. She was already moving toward a cabinet in the far wall. "Your grandmother's line is one of the older ones. The Voss family goes back to the pre-consolidation period, which in the Northern Territories means it goes back further than the Pack system, which means it goes back to the first people of this territory." She turned and looked at Alara. In 400 years of recorded compact history, Ethan has followed 4 people. 3 of them became queens. She held out a small dark-bound book. The 4th was a man, and he became the 2nd king of Velthorn. Alara took the book. Ara Voss would have had dormant abilities. Her line is old enough that the dormancy runs deep. Your ability to read the old scripts without instruction is one sign. There are others. A pause. You should be aware that Lady Seraphine has also been reading the compact documents. She had access to the restricted archive 3 weeks before you did. She has had more time to understand what the owl's behavior means. Alara absorbed this. She would know that the compact gives the recognized individual legal, protections. She would know considerably more than that, Kayla said. And she is a woman who protects her position with great thoroughness. Alara left the herbalist's room and stood in the corridor and assembled these pieces with the same careful attention she gave to archaic northern hand. Seraphine had been at Valthorn 3 weeks. The compact documents had been in the restricted archive for 400 years. Alara had been given access 8 days after the owl began following her. If someone with political interest in the outcome of a compact investigation had wanted to understand the process before it formally began, 3 weeks would have been sufficient time. And then, 3 days after Seraphine had seen Alara in the records office and confirmed her identity, the Boundary Codex had been brought to the archive with a translation request. Alara had translated the compact provisions, brought them to Penthan's attention, and been summoned to explain them to the king, who had then given her access to the restricted archive. Someone had wanted the king to know about the compact. Someone had engineered a delivery mechanism. But Seraphine would not want the king to take it seriously, unless she understood that the investigation was inevitable once the owl's behavior had been noted publicly, and had decided that controlling the investigation was better than preventing it. A formal lineage examination, in an era when the old bloodline records were incomplete, could produce any result that the person controlling the documentation wanted it to produce. She started walking quickly, because something that had been dormant and patient in her chest for 7 days was no longer entirely patient, and she needed to get back to the restricted archive before anyone else had access to the documents she'd been reading. She was halfway down the corridor to the north stairs when she turned a corner and walked directly into King Kalin. She stopped. He stopped. In the bar. Papers she was carrying scattered across the corridor floor, and she bent immediately to gather them, and he bent too at the same moment, which meant they were both on the floor of the corridor with their hands reaching for the same scattered documents, and their faces very close together in a way that was not covered by any protocol she had been trained in. He picked up the page nearest his hand and looked at it. It was her translation of the compact recognition clause. He looked at it for a moment. Then he looked at her. "You were running," he said. "I was walking quickly," she said. "Why?" She sat back on her heels and looked at him, and she found that when confronted with his direct gray gaze and the absence of any performance in it, the instinct she had most strongly was to match it, to be equally direct. "I believe the restricted archive documents may have been seen by someone I was not aware had access to them," she said, "before I was given access." He was quiet for a moment. "Who?" She told him about Seraphine, about the 3 weeks, about the sequence of events and what they suggested. He gathered the remaining papers himself and handed them to her with a care for their condition that was not what she would have predicted from a king in a corridor. "Come with me," he said. He took her to the north courtyard, which was empty at this hour. He stood in the center of the courtyard, and she stood beside him. And above them, there was a sound that was not exactly sound, a resonance. A low vibration she felt in her sternum, more than heard with her ears. And then Ethan descended. In flight, it was something her eyes needed a moment to adjust to. A thing that seemed to reorganize the available space in order to accommodate itself. The wingspan wider than she could take in with a single look. The movement of it through the cold air with a silence that made ordinary sound feel insufficient. It landed on the colonnade rail and folded its wings with the precision of 10,000 repetitions, and it looked at both of them. Kalen was looking at the owl, and his expression was different from anything she had seen on him before. Something opened in it that had been held at a distance. My father spent 20 years trying to earn Ethan's recognition, he said. When he died, I spent a year believing the owl's withdrawal was a judgment, that something had ended. He looked at her. It followed you on the third day. The first morning, she said. I noticed it on the third day. It may have been watching before that. Something moved in his face. The compact texts indicate that the abilities of the old bloodline families are often dormant until triggered, he said. In some cases, the trigger is proximity to a pack bond. In others, it is proximity to the sacred creature itself. In the oldest documented cases, it is both. He looked at the owl. She looked at her hands. She could see, very faintly, the beginning of something she had not been ready to see. Until now, a faint luminescence under the skin of her palms, the way light moved through river ice, pale and deep and old. She closed her hands. She opened them. It was still there. I see, she said, very quietly, to nobody in particular. Kalen looked at her hands. The formal examination of lineage, he said. I need to initiate it. I understand, she said. Lady Seraphine will contest it, he said. And he stated this plainly, without apology, and without false reassurance. Negotiations are at a critical stage. She has significant influence with 3 council members who manage the treaty ratification process. There will be pressure applied to the examination process. I believe the pressure may have already begun, she said. And she told him about what she had reasoned through in the corridor, the sequence of events, the possibility that the delivery of the compact provisions to his attention had been engineered. He listened without interrupting. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. If that is correct, he said, Seraphine already has a plan for what the examination will find, which is why you need the lineage documentation completed before the examination takes place, documented by someone not subject to outside influence. Kyla, she said. She has independent records of the old bloodline families. If my lineage is documented there, it cannot be altered retroactively. A pause. You have thought this through, he said. I think things through, she said. It is what I do. That was the moment. One corner of his mouth moved in the not-quite smile she had seen before, and this time it lasted a fraction of a second longer. It was such a small thing. She felt it through her entire body. The formal lineage examination was announced the following morning. The compact-recognized individual, Alara Voss, archive assistant, would be placed under the protection of the Crown for the duration of the investigation. The interference began that same afternoon, first as a visit from Seraphine's attendants to the archive, then 2 days later as a formal petition from Lords Vane and Crestholme to pause the proceedings pending review. The petition required response, and the response required the kind of time and attention that created friction in exactly the way Seraphine had clearly intended. Seraphine herself came to the archive the morning after the petition. She appeared alone, dressed simply in dark wool, which was the visual language of informality designed to suggest candor. She was extremely beautiful in a way that was somehow more apparent without the full armor of her court appearance, and she was fully aware of this. I would like to speak with you privately, she said. Alara dismissed the junior archivist and waited. Seraphine looked at the archive around her with the appreciation of someone who understood the value of information and recognized a workspace that produced it reliably. Then she looked at Alara. "You are intelligent," she said. "You have read the compact documents, and you understand the position we are both in. My understanding is that you are a young woman of uncertain lineage, placed at the center of a legal process that is politically inconvenient for the match that most people in this court believe is right for the kingdom. This process will be damaging to you either way. I am offering you a way out." "What is the way out?" Alara asked. "Withdraw," Seraphine said simply. "State that you do not believe the owl's behavior was recognition, that it was coincidental, and withdraw your compact claim. You return to the archive. The examination closes. Nothing changes for you." A pause. "I can ensure that your position in the archive is elevated. Senior archivist. Your own room, better salary, access to the full restricted catalog." Alara looked at her. "And for you, the alliance negotiation proceeds without the complication of a compact investigation disrupting the council's attention." "The match is right for the kingdom," Seraphine said, and she believed it. Alara could hear that she believed it, which was the most complicated thing about Seraphine. She was not simply cynical. She was a person who had assessed what was necessary and organized herself around it, with the full conviction of someone who had decided that the right thing and the strategic thing were, in her case, the same thing. Kaelin needs this alliance. The northern passes are essential to the kingdom's security. I am prepared for the role of queen. I would serve this kingdom well. "I do not doubt it," Alara said, because she did not. Seraphine looked at her for a moment, and something shifted in her expression, a brief crack in its precision through which something genuine appeared and was managed back. "You have approximately 3 days before the council members I have influence with begin to formally question the examination process," she said. "I suggest you use that time wisely." She left. Alara was afraid. She wanted to be honest with herself about that. She was afraid in the specific way of someone who has been invisible for a long time and is being asked to step into a space where she will be seen completely, and either claimed or rejected in public and in full. The fear was real and rational, and she did not want to dismiss it. But underneath it she felt something else. The thing she had been calling by other names for 8 days. The thing that was not coincidence and not familiarity and not professional interest. The thing that had felt, from the first morning she looked up and found amber eyes already watching, like recognition. Not the compact kind. The other kind. She was going to stay. She made this decision with the same quiet clarity with which she made all her real decisions, in the slow accumulation of everything she knew arranged into the only shape that made sense. And when it was made, it had the solidity of something that was always going to be true. She returned to the compact translation, and outside the archive window, Ethan settled into position with the patient certainty of a creature that had known the answer before the question was fully formed. The 3 days Seraphine had offered were actually 2.5, because on the third morning, Penthan sent word that Vane and Crestholm had formally petitioned to pause the examination proceedings. Alara's response was to go directly to Kayla's workroom and spend 4 hours ensuring that the documentation of her lineage was complete, thorough, cross-referenced with every available independent source. Kayla worked beside her with the focused economy of someone who had been expecting this moment for longer than Alara had been at the palace. "This is solid," Kayla said, looking over the finished documentation. "Whether the council chooses to honor it is a different question." Alara thought about the compact corpus she had been translating, and specifically, about a provision she had found on the 4th day of her work in the restricted archive, which she had noted carefully, and had not yet shared because she had not been certain it was relevant until now. She went back to the restricted archive. The provision was specific. In the event that a formal compact recognition was contested by members of the ruling council, the resolution of the contest was removed from council jurisdiction entirely and placed in the authority of 2 parties only, the sacred creature itself and the reigning Alpha King. The council had no authority to pause or review a compact examination that had already received the king's acknowledgement. Their petition was, under the actual terms of the compact, legally void. She translated this provision, cross-referenced it with the Land Grant Codex for consistency, and walked to the East Wing study of Lord Advisor Penthen, which was an action she had never taken before, and which produced, when she arrived and requested, entry, an expression on Penthen's face that was approximately equal parts surprise, apprehension, and the dawning awareness that he was about to have a bad afternoon. She showed him the provision. She showed him her cross-reference. She showed him the attestation documents. She did this with the calm, methodical thoroughness of someone presenting an archive finding, without raising her voice or showing any of the fear that was still present under everything else. Penthen read the provision. Twice. This removes the Council's review authority, he said. Entirely, she said. The petition from Lords Vane and Crestholm has no legal standing under the compact. The examination cannot be paused once the king has given his acknowledgement, which he did in the formal announcement 3 days ago. The king came to the archive that evening. It was after the regular hours, when the junior staff had gone, and only Alara remained, working in the lamplight. He came without announcement, and without Orsden, and without Penthen, which meant he had come himself. And something about the angle of the lamplight, and the fact of their being alone, made everything feel different from the formal settings of their other meetings, more direct, more present, less mediated by protocol. Penthen showed me the provision, he said. The council member's petition was withdrawn an hour ago. He came in and stood at the end of the reading table. Alara. He said her name with the same absence of decoration he brought to everything, and yet somehow it arrived in her chest with more weight than most things said with great effort. You found that provision today, while Penthen was already under instruction to formalize the pause request. I translated the compact corpus in order, she said. I reached the 7th document today. He looked at her steadily. You reached it at the precise moment it was needed. I work methodically, she said. That corner of his mouth again. This time it lasted long enough to become, unambiguously, a smile, small and real and private, the kind that arrived without being managed. I noticed that about you, he said. On the first day, you did not simplify the translation for Penthen's comfort. You gave him the accurate version, even though it was more complicated. A pause. The examination will take place at the end of the week. The full court will be present. I want you to understand what you are choosing. She looked at him. She thought about the fear, which was still there, and probably always would be a little. And she thought about what was in her palms, the luminescence she had stopped pretending she had not seen, and about the owl on the ledge every morning, and about this man in an archive in the lamplight, saying you are considerably more than an archivist with the matter-of-fact directness of someone stating a truth he had simply observed. I understand what I am choosing, she said. He looked at her for a long moment, and in his gray eyes she saw something she had been seeing there since the archive, something that was not managed, that the king of Valethorn who had spent years learning not to be warm was, in this specific room, in this specific lamplight, not particularly interested in managing. She felt herself almost smile, and did not stop herself. He left her to her translation. She sat for a long time in the lamplight after he was gone, and outside on the window ledge, Ethan breathed its slow, enormous rhythm. And Alara Voss, who had been invisible for a very long time, sat with the feeling of being about to be seen, and found that it was less frightening than it had been, progressively, in the direction of something that felt, cautiously and carefully, like readiness. If you want to see how this story ends, make sure you are subscribed with notifications on. The night before the examination, Alara did not sleep. She sat in the window of the room she had been given under the crown protection, a considerably nicer room than she had occupied in the servants' quarters. And she looked at the sky doing the thing it did in the deep winter nights above Valethorn, shifting through colors that had no ordinary names. She sat in the window and felt the thing in her blood, the thing she had no word for yet, except that it was warm and old, and had apparently been there all along, quietly, waiting for her to have the sense to notice it. The luminescence was not in her palms now. but in her blood. She could feel it moving through her like the sensation of warmth returning to hands that have been cold, the specific prickle and glow of something coming back to life. It was not frightening anymore, because it was hers. It had always been hers. Ethan was on the courtyard parapet below her window. She could see the white shape of it in the moonlight, vast and still. "I understand now," she said very quietly, to the cold glass of the window, to the owl below, to herself. "I understand why you watched." She pressed her palm against the cold glass and saw the faint glow of it, the light under her skin, and left it there for a moment. Then she lay down and breathed until morning came. The examination took place in the Great Hall. The Great Hall of Valethorn was designed not for comfort, but for the making of things permanent, for the kinds of events that required the weight of stone and the height of ceilings and the formal arrangement of witnesses. The council sat in the upper gallery. The court was gathered below, nobility in the front ranks and palace staff in the back. The king's chair was on the raised dais at the head of the hall. Penthen stood to the left with the compact corpus, translated and annotated. The two windows of the great hall that looked onto the north courtyard were open, both of them, despite the cold, because Ethan did not enter buildings through doors. Ilara stood at the center of the hall in the deep blue-gray dress Orsden had sent that morning, the sea color of the winter sky above the courtyard. She stood and looked at the people around her, the court in its formal arrangement, the council in the gallery, Seraphine in the front rank of the nobility with her face composed and her position impeccable. And she breathed slowly and let the fear be present without letting it be primary. Underneath the fear, steady and warm and old, was the other thing. The thing that was hers. The thing that had always been hers. Penthen read the compact provisions. Aloud, the original ecclesiastical northern hand, and then Ilara's translation, because the king had specified that both should be read so that the meaning was clear to everyone present. The lineage documentation was presented by Kayla, who did it with the matter-of-fact competence of someone who had spent 50 years keeping records of things that mattered. The independent attestations were entered into the record. Lords Vane and Crestholm in the gallery looked at the documentation with the expressions of people who had planned to challenge something and found it less challengeable than expected. Then the windows opened. She heard it before she saw it, the slow, enormous sound of Ethan's wings. And then the owl was in the great hall, and the entire court was still in the way of people who have just found themselves in the presence of something that exceeds ordinary categories. The stillness of genuine awe, rather than performed respect. Ethan landed on the crossbeam above the center of the hall, directly above Ilara, and it was vast in the space of the great hall, in a way that made the hall itself feel like something smaller and more intimate. It folded its wings. It looked at the hall, and then it looked at her. Down. Directly. With those amber eyes that had been finding her in courtyards and stacks and archive windows for 10 days. With the same patient, complete, certain attention they had always held when they were on her. She looked up at it. The hall was very quiet. "Ilara Voss," Penthen said, his voice carrying to every corner of the space. "In accordance with the pre-consolidation compact of Valethorn, you are called to receive the formal recognition of Ethan, sovereign entity of these lands, in the presence of the ruling king and the gathered court." She kept her gaze on the owl. The warmth in her blood was stronger now, the luminescence closer to the surface, and she stopped holding it back. She let it be there. She let it be visible, the faint glow at her hands, the light that moved under her skin, like the memory of every winter her blood had survived. And she felt, for the first time in her life, completely like herself. Not the careful, precise, invisible archivist. Not the daughter of a scattered bloodline. Not the girl from Voss settlement who made herself small so the world would have less reason to look at her. Herself. The full version. The one that had been dormant. The one that had been looking at the sky every morning, waiting for something to be worth waking up for. Ethan descended from the crossbeam. It descended slowly, with that enormous controlled silence. And it landed not on the colonnade or the rail, but on the floor of the great hall, 5 feet from Alara. And it was standing beside her in the same room, and the scale of it was staggering. The breadth of its folded wings, the height of its body, the weight of its amber gaze. The court was absolutely still. The council in the gallery had forgotten to perform neutrality. Even Seraphine in the front rank had abandoned her composure for something that looked, for just a moment, like genuine wonder before it was retrieved and managed. The owl looked at Alara. It tilted its head, slowly, in the way it had tilted its head in the courtyard, and in the stacks and in every window ledge it had occupied for 10 days. The gesture of a creature examining something with profound and patient interest. And then, with the deliberation of something that had waited a very long time for this specific moment, it lowered its head until it was level with hers, until those amber eyes were at the height of her face, close enough that she could feel the warmth of it, close enough that she could see her own reflection in those great amber eyes, a pale-haired woman with light in her hands, standing in a great hall, looking back. She raised her hand and placed it, flat, against the dense white feathers of Ethan's neck. The light in her palms blazed. Not painfully, not dramatically, simply completely, the way a lamp blazes when you have been managing it low for a long time and finally allow it to burn at its proper height. It moved up her arm and through her whole body, warm and old and vast, like something that had been in a very small container for a very long time, and was finally permitted to be the size it actually was. And Ethan made a sound that was not a sound so much as a resonance, the same low vibration she had felt in her sternum. When the owl descended in the courtyard, but larger here, in the stone hall, moving through the walls and the floor and the gallery where the council sat, the sound of confirmation, of something completing, of a thing that had been said over and over in a language nobody had known how to hear until this moment. She was still herself. This was the thing she noticed first, after the light. She was still Alara, still precise and observant and slightly afraid of what came next, still the person who counted seconds when her body forgot to move, and who read old texts in dead languages for the pleasure of understanding them. She was all of that. She was also the person her blood had always been, the descendant of the old families of the Northern Territories, the woman whose grandmother had looked at the same winter sky with the same ache. Both things were true. Both were hers. She lowered her hand. The light faded to its resting level, still present, still perceptible, but quiet. Ethan straightened to its full height and settled its wings with the finality of something that has completed what it came to do. It looked at the hall with the absolute authority of something that had been sovereign in this territory before sovereignty was a concept humans had invented, and then it turned its amber eyes to the king. Kaelin rose from the chair on the dais. She had not allowed herself to look at him during the examination, because she had needed all of herself for Ethan, for the thing. She was doing and feeling, and had not had anything to spare for what she felt when she looked at him. But she looked at him now, as he came down from the dais, walking toward her with the directness and absence of performance she associated with everything he did, his gray eyes on her face, and in them the thing she had been not naming for 10 days, the thing that sat in the space between them with the certainty of something that had already been decided. He stopped in front of her. The hall was completely silent. He looked at her for a moment, and she looked back, and the fear was still there, quietly, underneath everything. The fear of being this visible, this present, this claimed by her own truth in front of everyone. But underneath the fear was the other thing, warmer and older, and considerably more insistent, the thing that had a direction. "Alara Voss," he said, and his voice carried to the hall, formal and clear, the king's voice. But his eyes on hers were something else, something that was just his, just theirs. Under the terms of the pre-consolidation compact of Veilthorn, and in acknowledgement of the formal recognition of Ethan, I recognize your lineage and your claim. You are of the old bloodlines of this territory. You are under the protection of this crown. Confirmed. He paused. And I would ask, he said, and this part was quieter. The voice of the man who had stood beside her in the archive in the lamplight and told her she was considerably more than an archivist. If you would permit me to understand what this means for us both, not quickly, not politically, but honestly. She looked at him. She thought about 4 years of careful invisibility, about the north courtyard and the sky and the old scripts that arrived in her mind like something remembered. She thought about amber eyes finding her in the morning, and a corner of a mouth that moved toward something genuine when she said things she actually meant. She thought about what it felt like to stop being careful about everything. I am not going anywhere, she said. And then, because precision was the thing she trusted most. And yes, honestly, something moved in his face that she would spend a long time afterward trying to find the right word for, some combination of relief and recognition, and the quality of a man who has been holding something very carefully for a very long time and has just been given permission to put some of it down. His hand came up, and he offered it to her, palm up, the gesture of reception described in the recognition ceremony. And she placed her hand in his, and the light in her palm met the warmth of his skin, and the hall around them was completely, absolutely still. Seraphine, in the front rank, was watching. Her expression was composed, nearly perfectly composed, and then entirely composed, and she was the first person to begin the formal acknowledgement, placing her hand on her chest and inclining her head, which was the court gesture of recognition, and which, coming from her, was remarkable enough that it moved through the rest of the nobility in a ripple, one and then another, and then all of them, the acknowledgement spreading through the great hall of Valethorn from front to back. Elara stood in the great hall with her hand in the king's, and the light in her blood, and Ethan an enormous white presence beside her, and 200 people performing the gesture of recognition, and she was visible, completely visible, in the way she had spent 4 years avoiding and 10 days approaching, and she found that it was not what she had been afraid it would be. She had thought visibility would feel like exposure, like stepping outside after being inside too long, the air hitting you with nothing between you and the elements. Instead, it felt like the sky, like the north courtyard in the early morning when the winter light came at that angle that made everything vivid and present. The sky in those colors that had no names. And she would stand there and feel the ache of it in her chest. The ache that was not pain, but was the feeling of being alive and knowing it. Like that. Exactly like that. Later, when the hall had cleared and the formalities had concluded, Kaelin walked with her through the north courtyard. The winter air was cold in the specific clean way of the deep afternoon. They walked without speaking for a while in the way of people who are comfortable enough with each other to let silence be what it is. Seraphine will negotiate new terms for the northern passes, he said finally. The Aldecor family's cooperation is strategic. She will present it as having been her intention all along to support the compact process once its legitimacy was established. She gave the acknowledgement first, Elara said. Yes. He looked at her briefly. You saw that. She decided that opposing you publicly was less useful than being the person who recognized correctly first, Elara said. She is not wrong. About the northern passes. The alliance reframed around a trade partnership rather than a marriage contract serves everyone's interests. She understood this and chose adaptation over resistance. A pause. I have spent 4 years cataloging the long record of what people do when they want things badly enough. Most of it is less elegant than what she did today. He was quiet for a moment. They had reached the center of the courtyard, and above them on the high tower, Ethan had returned to its old perch, a vast white shape against the pale winter sky. I need to tell you something, he said, and something in his voice had shed another layer of the management he wore with the same practice with which she wore her precision. I saw you on the 5th morning, you and Ethan, in the courtyard, from my study window. I had been watching Ethan for 11 years without it moving, and then I looked out, and it had come down from the towers, and it was watching you look at the sky. A pause. The way you looked at the sky. Nobody looks at the sky like that. I did not know what it meant. I knew that I kept looking. She felt the warmth in her blood, steady and present. You arranged the Boundary Codex translation, she said. Penthen brought it to me 3 weeks ago, before I knew about the owl's behavior, he said. But when I saw the owl in the courtyard that morning, I remembered Penthen telling me there was a translation needed. I asked who was best suited to translate the Ecclesiastical Northern Hand, and he told me there was a junior archivist who could read it without assistance. He looked at her steadily. I wanted you in the room where I could understand what I was looking at. You did not arrange Seraphine's presence in the records office, she said. No, that was her own design. So 2 people used the same document to put me in the same room, she said, for entirely different reasons. Yes, he looked at her. My reason was less strategic than hers. Considerably less strategic, she agreed. And the corner of his mouth moved, all the way this time, into a smile that was full and real and personal, and changed his face into something younger, and less managed, and completely his. And she felt it in every part of herself that was already complicated about him. What happens now? She asked. Now the court adjusts, he said. The council negotiates. The compact documentation is formally entered into the legal record. A pause. And you translate. The full compact corpus, because it is incomplete, and I want it complete. And you are the only person in this palace who can do it accurately. That will take several months, she said. I expect so, he said. And then? She asked, because she was a person who preferred to understand the full scope of what she was agreeing to. He looked at her with those gray eyes that were the color of the winter sky in the last hour before dawn, and he did not manage what was in them. And then, he said, we take the time to understand this properly. You said honestly. I intend to hold you to that. I do not make statements I do not mean, she said. No, he said. I noticed that about you too. Above them, on the high tower, Ethan sat in the late afternoon light with its wings folded and its amber eyes on the courtyard, patient and present and certain with the certainty of something that had waited a very long time and had at last arrived at the moment it had been waiting for. The winter sky. Above Valthorn shifted through colors that had no names, and the cold was clean and real. And in the center of the north courtyard, Alara Voss, who was no longer invisible, and was not entirely afraid of that, stood beside the king who had looked out his window on the 5th morning and chosen to keep looking, and she tilted her face up toward the sky because she always had, and because now she understood why, and the light in her blood was warm and old, and finally, fully, awake. She spent the weeks after the examination in the restricted archive, now properly lit with 2 additional lamps she had requested and received without question. She translated the compact corpus from beginning to end, all 14 documents, and she found in the process things she had not expected, a history of the Northern Territories older and stranger and more continuous than any court record she had encountered. She found a passage in the oldest document, so early that the script was the most archaic form, of the Ecclesiastical Northern Hand, that she spent 3 days working through, and when she finally had it in plain language, she sat with it for a long time. The passage described the original compact between the first human inhabitants of the territory and Ethan, and it described the role of the owl not as a guardian or a judge, but as a witness, a keeper of memory, a creature that existed to remember what time and politics and the ordinary erosion of things caused people to forget, that the old bloodlines had always been here, that the land carried them in its substance the way the sky carried light, that whatever was built upon this territory was built upon the foundation of their presence, and that from time to time a person would appear in whom this truth was particularly clear, and Ethan's role was simply to see them and to say, to whoever would listen, in whatever manner was available to it, here. This one. Look. She wrote this at the front of the complete document when she delivered it, with a note explaining that this passage was foundational to understanding everything that followed, because without it, the rest was law. And with it, the rest was something that law was attempting, imperfectly, to describe. The Aldecor trade partnership was concluded through the winter, and proved, as Seraphine had anticipated, strategically sound. Better in several respects than the marriage contract would have been. Seraphine departed in the early spring with her position. Enhanced rather than diminished, having demonstrated the particular quality of someone who assesses a situation quickly and accurately and chooses adaptation over resistance. Kaelin came to the archive in the evenings, not every evening, but often, and sometimes he would stay and read in the chair across from her desk, and sometimes they would talk about the archive and the kingdom and the compact, and about smaller things, the particular way the light moved through the high windows in the late afternoon. His father's habit of quoting the pre-consolidation scholars when he wanted to make a point indirectly, her grandmother's eyes and what she thought she understood now about the ache in them when they looked at the sky. They took the time she had said they would take, with the care of people who understood that the things worth having were worth building properly. Above the north wing, Ethan kept its watch. In the spring, when the snow on the tower parapet began to melt and the quality of the light above Velthorn shifted into the longer, warmer days, the owl sometimes spread its wings in the morning, and Alara would see, from her window, the enormous white span of it catching the sun, and she would think about the oldest text, about witness and memory, and the land carrying its people, the way the sky carried light, and she would feel the warmth in her blood and the ache in her chest that was not pain, and she would know, with the precision she gave to everything, she truly believed that this was not an ending. This was a beginning, the kind that had been waiting, patiently, for exactly as long as it needed to wait, and had arrived in the particular form of a woman who looked at the sky in the mornings, and a creature vast and ancient with amber eyes that had seen everything and chosen, out of everything, to see her first. If this story touched your heart, share it with someone who loves epic romance. Tell me in the comments, did you see this ending coming?